I'm so excited to get to be here, even if it's just virtually. My name's Genevieve Bell, and I'm coming to you from Australia. And I want to talk to you a little bit about, well, the history of the future. I know that sounds like a crazy title, but I realize this isn't a talk about technology per se, or even the future. It's more a meditation on the history of our future and the stories that got us here, and the stories that we tell and the stories that we don't always tell. And so for me, while history rarely gives us the answers, it at least helps us shape better questions and better points of view about the future. So where would we start? Well, I want to start where I am today, which is on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra, Australia. And I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present. This land's sacred and never was ceded. And it's an extraordinary place to get to make the future. There's something quite wondrous in knowing that you're in a country, in a place where people have been inventing and making and keeping the future for 60,000 years. And whenever I talk about technology or I talk about the future, I get to do it with the knowledge and the responsibility of doing it in a place where people have been doing that, well, forever. Some located talk in the place that it starts. And for me, it starts here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. I realize that probably makes it pretty clear that I'm not you Bell at the outset. I should probably also tell you some other things about myself. I am a distinguished professor here at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. I'm the director of a brand new school, the School of Cybernetics. It started 9 months ago. Small panic right there. I am also a senior fellow and a vice president at Intel and Intel Labs, where I have spent the better part of the last 23 years now helping to invent the future. I am somewhere in all those titles and biographies also a cultural anthropologist. I'm the daughter of an anthropologist. I grew up on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. I spent my time living with Aboriginal people in their communities, in the places they made meaning in their lives, and it was an extraordinarily rich childhood. My dad's an engineer, and so somewhere between those two different points of view and two different ways of thinking and being, I found myself in the United States. I got my PhD in cultural anthropology at Stanford University, and in 1998, after a fateful encounter with a man in a bar in Palo Alto, don't take career advice from me, just a short note there, I took a job at Intel, where my responsibility was to help think about how knowledge about what human beings care about what they're passionate about what makes people tick, about what they want for themselves, their communities, their countries, how all of those things should inform how we make next generation technology products. And so over the arc of the last 2 decades, I have been working out how you bring together technology development, cultural practice, and keep all of those things in dialogue. How do we bring together humans and technology, and how do we make new things as a result of that? And in that process, I spent a lot of time thinking about technology, about how we got to this moment in time and about all of its history. But like I said, these days I'm a professor for the most part here in Australia, and I spend a lot of time teaching my students about the future. But I sometimes think in order to do that really effectively, you've got to go back a little bit. And when we spend our time talking about artificial intelligence and talking about robots and talking about ethics and talking about the digital world and even about cyberspace if we're old-fashioned, we're not really good at saying where did all that stuff start and what are its beginnings, because in its beginnings are the way it unfolds now. And so I want to go back a little bit and talk a little bit about the history of the world we now live in. So where would you start? Well, one place to start would be Prague in 1921. I know, thinking, Prague, 1921? What's that got to do with today? Well, 100 years ago actually, in 9 months, a play premiered in Prague. It was a play by Czechoslovakian playwright Karl Čapek. It was his second or third play. He was a writer. He was a poet. He and his family and his country were coming out the other side of World War I, which had been the most extraordinary thing. It had shaped everyone's daily lives. It had been technology at a scale that no one could have imagined. It had been a reshaping of state boundaries and interpersonal relationships and allegiances and alliances, and it had changed the way we thought about time and space, and also how we thought about mechanization and industrialization and machinery. And in the face of all of that, Čapek wrote a play, and the play was about a factory, Rossum's factory. And in that factory, Rossum made biomechanical hybrid men, and those men were designed to replace the tasks that humans didn't want to do. And in the arc of the play, Rossum, the factory owner, continues to create these mechanical creatures, and these mechanical creatures do the drudgery jobs. And over the arc of the play, the mechanical creatures become sufficiently angry about their lot in life that they come back and demand to be given more than just unpleasant labor. They demand happiness, they demand the right to live longer, they demand the right to have a life, to be emancipated. And in the final scenes of the play, the makers of the robots refuse that, and the robots kill them. Now, I just gave away the plot, because those mechanical men in that play were called robots. But what makes this play special back in 1921 was that was the first time the word was ever used. Čapek invented it. It's a made-up word. He pulled it through from his natal language. He created a sound, a word that was a play on the word in English, serf or drudge. It was a play on a particular kind of notion of labor. And he and his brother, who was another artist and poet of the vintage, decided between the two of them to make up a special word for these biomechanical men. And that special word was robot, from robota. Now, a play in Prague in 1921 is usually just a play in Prague in 1921, except this play went viral. It was translated into multiple languages. It turned up on Broadway in New York, the West End in London. It premiered in Japan and in Sydney. It went all over the world. It is the first piece of science fiction, because that's what we would call it. It's the first piece of science fiction to be televised on the radio. It was on the BBC. It was the first piece of science fiction to be on television. It's also on the BBC. And it was a play that stayed in currency for decades. And the word robot got loose. It got loose from that play. And by 1929, an Englishman named Richards decided he was going to make his own robot, not in the play, but an actual one. And he built a robot, 6 foot tall. It opened the annual Motor Engineering Conference of 1929 in Brighton, I believe, in the pavilion. And the robot's name was Eric. It was very shiny and blue lights for eyes, and it could talk. And the human fascination with making robots has continued apace ever since. But that first robot was a work of art. It was a creation of literature. And indeed, the story of that first robot is the story we keep telling in movies ever since. It's the story that should sound vaguely familiar if you're a fan of Blade Runner, like I am, because I'm old, or you're a fan of the Terminator series or any of the more recent movies. That story about a robot wanting more for itself, it's an archetype that starts here in 1921. Of course, for those of you who are in the know, it's a story that's older than that. That's a story of Frankenstein and of Gollum. It is a story that runs through literature. When we talk about making robots, when we talk about the robotic, when we talk about robots themselves, the very first robot was in a play in Prague in 1921. We could ask the same questions about computers. Where did that start? Where did our notion of the computation and the digital start? Well, one way to think about it is that it starts with Vannevar Bush, a man who had many remarkable claims to fame and who held many interesting jobs, but who in 1945 wrote an article called As We May Think, and it was published in the Atlantic Monthly in America. And he asks the readers to consider a future in which an individual stores all of his books and records and communications in a mechanized way so that it can be consulted with exceeding speed and so that it will enlarge and supplement our memories. That should sound familiar. 1945, Vannevar Bush has basically cracked the back of the internet and the web and the cloud. He imagined a world where all of those things would happen. So maybe there's a way where the current world came into being because it was summoned, it was called into being in a future prediction. Of course, it was also being built in real time, starting in 1944 in Bletchley Park in England, when the Colossus was built, one of the very first computers. Could also be Eckert and Maudsley, and John von Neumann in 1945, who built the ENIAC and switched it on at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where in Philadelphia they used to say you could tell they were computing at the university because the lights would flicker all over town, because that computer was so power hungry that it took 5 suburbs worth of electricity to basically add up and subtract. The computing power that is in your phone is so many times more powerful than the ENIAC, it just does not actually bear comparison. There was the Zeus in Germany, and here in Australia there was a computer called CYRAC. It's a picture of it on the screen here. And CYRAC was another one of these early stored memory computers, and it was big, I think 2 shipping containers basically, and power hungry, and it was loud and noisy and smelly. So I don't really think about computers, but they smell bad. There's all this dust and burning fuses. And even in spite of all of that, people looked at these objects and imagined that there would be this remarkable future that was coming, that these machines would get smaller and faster and more powerful. And at every point, 1945, 1948, 1949, as these machines turned on, people started to imagine, what would the world like? What would it be like? What would happen? And how would it all unfold? By 1956, so 10 years after those first computers, lots of things had already changed. Computers have gotten much smaller. They've gone from a shipping container to the size of, 2 or 3 big refrigerators. They were infinitely more powerful in terms of what they could do and a little less power hungry. They were at places like IBM and Bell Labs. They were in various government organizations and across the US and in a lesser extent, the UK and Europe, and a little bit in Australia and a few other places around the world. People started to say, well, if the last 10 years could go from these massive things to these much smaller things, and they'd go from being able to add and subtract to doing quite an array of things, what is that trajectory going to set us up for? And what is the potential for the power of all that computing? And a group of people gathered at Dartmouth College on the east coast of the United States in the summer of 1956. And they had funding from the Rockefeller Foundation and the RAND, and they had been funded to do, delightfully, what they wrote was a 2-month, 10-man study. And they were going to go off and explore the power of computing. And what they had written in their grant proposal was that the study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can be in principle described so precisely that a machine can be made to simulate it. So what they're saying there is we can describe and categorize every way that intelligence functions, not necessarily human intelligence, but intelligence functions. We're going to be able to describe it into small enough pieces that we can make a machine do all those things. So we're going to be able to take intelligence, break it into its constituent pieces, and we're going to be able to teach machines to do those things. And they go on to say, and an attempt will be made to find how to make machines use language, form abstractions and concepts, solve kinds of problems now reserved for humans, and improve themselves. So 4 things. Use language. So think both speech recognition, but also speech. Form abstractions and concepts. So be able to make sense of things. So think computer vision, but also think an ability to understand things that are abstract, democracy, freedom, strategy. Solve the kinds of problems currently reserved for humans. In the context of 1956, that meant a lot of military functions mostly, but to be able to think strategy, arm weapons, respond to threats, but also make decisions, also operate machinery, and then improve themselves or learn. That bundle of things, those 4 things, the people at this conference, they called that artificial intelligence. And they said, this is what we want to do, is work out if we can do this. Can we make a machine? Can we basically describe the human intellect, because it became the human intellect, in small enough pieces that a machine can do it? And if we can it do these things? If all of those things can happen, then we will have something that they wanted to call artificial intelligence. For those early proponents of AI, they came from all over the place. They came out of universities, absolutely, but they also came out of industry. One of the principals there was Claude Shannon, who is responsible for information theory and who was at Bell Labs. There was also Nathaniel Rochester, who was at IBM and who was responsible for IBM's most recent mainframes. And then there were postdocs, names that we would now recognize in AI, like Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy. But at the time, they were young and new, and they were desperately trying to debate what the thing would be. And of course, it's really important to remember in 1956, AI wasn't about a technology, it was a research agenda. It was about an idea of where computers might go. And oh, by the way, they thought that would all take 10 years. Everything that's on that screen there, that was a 10-year plan, which you've got to admit, pretty ambitious, because many, many years later, we've still not entirely got there on a number of those pieces. So that's 1956. A little bit later, still, another decade passes, and computing has continued to evolve and get more sophisticated. And there's another really important moment to the world that we are now in. And a lot of other people involved. So, well, AI may not have unfolded according to plans. Lots of people are still interested in funding computing and in thinking about where computing will go and in building out that whole world. And computers are continuing to get smaller and smaller and more powerful and more distributed. And more people have their hands on them. And it's a really kind of messy, delightful world. You've got new funding bodies all over the world doing stuff. And in 1968, in San Francisco, the Association for Computer Machinery, a ponderous title for an organization that was basically where anyone who had anything to do with computers used to gather once a year. A man named Doug Engelbart, who's in the picture here pointing his finger. Doug Engelbart, along with a bunch of his colleagues who were down at Stanford, at the Stanford Research Institute at SRI, they demoed something at that conference called the online system. And you can still see this demo. You're not going to do it while I'm talking. When I'm finished, you would Google YouTube, go to YouTube and type in the mother of all demos and Engelbart, and you will get the full demo, 90 minutes, because he filmed it all. And it's still online, and it is still, in some ways, the most remarkable thing, because there is Engelbart demoing the mouse, cut and paste, a version of the internet, a version of hyperlinking and hypertext, and something that mostly we could think of as, well, you know, contemporary computing. These days, we sometimes call this the mother of all demos. Wired magazine gave us that title for it years later. But it was this remarkable thing. It was partly funded by DARPA, partly funded by the American Air Force. And it was about thinking through what would computing look like when it was no longer a big mainframe that you had to take a computing request to, when computing would be distributed and sit on your desks. And what might that look like? And the kinds of people that were in the room at that moment in time include, well, the who's who of Silicon Valley over the next 20 years. And what they saw that day, they saw the future on display, a whole way of thinking about the world that was remarkable and like nothing else. And there is something intensely seductive about that demo, even still, because as you watch it, you think to yourself, here is a man showing us the future. And he had enough presence of mind to know that the future would involve a complexity of things and a set of stories, and that it wouldn't just be about the technology, but about what we do with it. But of course, sitting behind all of that, Engelbart himself also knew new technology was coming. So it wasn't just that he was demoing stuff that he'd invented, he was also demoing things that he had line of sight to. And one of the things that's very clear in that online system, or this NLS, it's sometimes called system, was the internet, which turns up less than a year later, with many of the same people involved. So Engelbart in Menlo Park in California, so Northern California, and Leonard Kleinrock at UCLA, so the other end of California, work out how to connect two telephones so that you can link them up and share data. Doesn't sound particularly sexy or particularly interesting, except that's how the internet started in October in 1969. The best part about it is they connected the two computers. They're on the phone talking to each other to show that they're doing it. And the entire system crashes in the middle of the first demo, which feels somehow appropriate in a world where, 50 plus years later, those two systems still aren't entirely stable. But by the back end of 69, there were already 4 universities connected up. So UCLA, Utah, UC Santa Barbara, and Stanford. And over the years, it would grow many, many more connections. And by the 1980s, it would stop just being universities and start being the general public. And by the late 1980s, early 1990s, it would stop being the internet and it would start being the web. And by the late 1990s, it wouldn't just be computers, it would be all kinds of other things that would be connected up. And in some ways, the world we talk about today in the 21st century, the world we talk about robots and computers and AI and the internet and the digital, all of those things didn't start recently. We have a history that we are building on today that's 100 years old, and it's a history that connects art and literature and scientists and industry and governments and universities, that connects conferences and theaters and all manner of different kinds of impulses and different things people thought they were doing. And so by the time we get to 2021, it's a very different world. And by the time we get into the 21st century, we have all of that history that's coming with us. For me, that history lands in a very particular way. So in 2017, I came back to Australia from America, where I had spent most of my adult life living. And I came back because this whole history, this history of robots and AI and computers and the internet, were leading in a direction. And I wanted a different role in that direction than I had had. So in 2017, I established an institute here at the Australian National University. One really simple, possibly overly ambitious agenda. I decided that looking at that history, where I knew we had seen the creation of new technologies and accompanying new disciplines, I thought, well, AI and the internet and the digital and robotics require some other voices in the room than we've always had. And for me, I thought, well, as AI stops being a research agenda and starts becoming an actual constellation of technologies, and those technologies increasingly scale up and disappear off this laptop in front of me and turn up in traffic lights and elevators and the electrical grid and the smart lights in my room, which have inexplicably turned off, and the camera I'm staring into, and the doors in my building, that as each one of those took on a piece of an AI puzzle, we were going to need a different set of skills than we had, a complementary set. And so when I started this institute back in 2017, it had one overly ambitious mission, which was to establish a new branch of engineering to take AI safely, responsibly, and sustainably to scale. Because I could see that scale was coming, and I wanted it to be safe, and I wanted it to be responsible, and I knew it had to be sustainable. And so I thought, well, who's going to do that work? Can't just be computer scientists. They have a lot of other work to do. It probably isn't all the traditional engineers we have, though we need all of them too. And so I decided, with the help of a small group of people, that maybe we should build something new. And so we started the process of doing that here. Initially, the Vice Chancellor of the Australian National University said to me, "What are you going to call this new branch of engineering, Genevieve?" And I was like, I don't know. And I still truthfully don't. And so we didn't call the institute after the branch of engineering. We named the institute after the questions we thought needed to be most answered initially about AI systems. So the 3 A's in the 3A Institute stand for autonomy, agency, and assurance, because we thought those were the big first questions. So will the system be autonomous? If so, what will it get to do or not do? And if it is autonomous and it's doing things, who's going to get to say it's safe? And what would be safe mean? And so for us, we thought, well, okay, you're going to build a new branch of engineering. How are you going to do that? So we figured 3 really simple ways. We're going to teach it into existence. We were going to research it into existence. And we were going to theorize it into existence. Like I said, it seemed really simple. Actually, that's not true. As soon as I said, build a new branch of engineering, I knew we were in dangerously ambitious territory. But I also knew that that was the easiest way to make the future. Alan Kay, wonderful American computer scientist, once declared that the best way to predict the future is to build it. And I have a lot of time for that notion. And so I thought, well, if AI is coming, we need to build a framework to make sense of it. And so we started. We did a bunch of different things. We started teaching. So we built an experimental master's program. We went from having no educational program to having an educational program in 150 days. For those of us in industry, that seems like a very long time. For those of us in universities, that seems like a very short time. Somewhere in the middle, it just seemed like a lot of paperwork. But we decided we should have an advanced graduate degree. So we established a master's program. We recruited students. We brought them in from all over the world and from every discipline we could think of and from all walks of life. We've just finished up the third program and recruiting our fourth cohort. They'll start in February of next year, which is incredibly exciting. We decided to layer a PhD program on top of that. And then because we were so aware that not everyone can come to Canberra, not everyone can give a year or 3 years of their lives to a degree program, we realized that we also needed to build a set of other ways to encounter us. So micro-learning experiences. So how could we take what we did well and share it with everyone else? How do we take the skills we have in-house and bring other people along on that journey? And all the while, we've had to work out, how do you teach something into existence? How do you find the right ways of being hands-on in the classroom and project-based and iterative with a curriculum that is as diverse as our students? And it's been the most extraordinary thing. Oh gosh, it's been amazing. And all of our students go and do internships and have experiences beyond the classroom, because that's really important. And I'm happy to report that 3 years in, our student cohorts have always been really diverse, been 50% female, which in a College of Engineering and Computer Science is a big thing. We have had students from every discipline and pretty much from all over the world. So we tried teaching it into existence. We tried researching it too. So look at all the places where people were building next generation technical systems, all the places where people were building things with AI at their core. So we've spent time in mining companies and banks and with scientific research organizations and with theater groups, all the while trying to work out, what does it mean as these systems are being built and go into scale? And then last but by no means least, we realized we should have a theoretical framework. How do we want to think about these systems that we were building, and where should we go looking for a theory? And the answer turned out to be also back in our history with something called cybernetics. Now, I'm willing to bet a few of you know that word, and you come like, oh, that's really vaguely familiar. Of course, it's been in science fiction too. This is another word that turns up in Blade Runner and the Terminator series, as well as other places. A bit of Douglas Adams too, if you like British science fiction. But it's a term that also has its history in the earliest days of computing. So back when Bletchley Park was at its heyday and the Colossus and Babe were being built in England and America was making the ENIAC, a group of thinkers from all over points of the compass gathered in New York City to debate what the future should be like. And they did it with the knowledge of what World War II had been and about how computing had been used. And they did it safe in the knowledge that the world they wanted to build couldn't be the world that they had seen. And they created a framework, an approach to the future that they called cybernetics. And cybernetics was a theory of systems, or a theory of the system, basically, that the system was dynamic so that it had feedback in it. It had circular causality, so these pieces of the system were in a reciprocal relationship with each other. And that system always and already included the technical, the human, and the ecological. Oh yeah, and that those systems would change over time, because those systems would have computers in them, right? And that computational frame would make the world different. And for people like John von Neumann and Claude Shannon and Norbert Wiener, but also Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson and Stafford Beer and a whole lot of others, the idea of cybernetics was hugely generative. It was an idea that, well, gave birth to AI. All the participants in the AI conference had been in the cybernetics conferences. It's also an idea that gave birth to computer art and design. It's an idea that gave us design thinking. It's an idea that shaped most of Silicon Valley. It's an idea that Engelbart was in dialogue with. So as you unfold all of those earlier histories of computing, you find cybernetics as one of the well springs, one of the places where ideas came. And so for us, as we thought about how do you build a new thing, well, one of the ways is you go back looking in history for better questions to ask. And one of the questions we kept asking was, what is the system we are building and how would we think about it well? And so we've continued to bring new voices into the picture and new skills. We've continued to think about, as we have graduated from having the Institute in 2017 to a brand new School of Cybernetics in 2021, how do you do all of that? And how do you ensure that you are building this system, this branch of engineering, this way of thinking about AI, not as a technology, but as part of a system, and a system that has a set of histories and a set of possibilities and a set of futures. And for us, that's meant, well, it's always a bit of a work in progress. It's meant we've built a new school here at the ANU. It's the first new school at the Australian National University in about 30 years. I think it's the first school of cybernetics in Australia. It's certainly the first new school of cybernetics on a global scale in about 2 generations. And it's a mad adventure. And it's an adventure and a journey I'm profoundly committed to, because sitting in my DNA, I guess, certainly in my lived experience and my work experience, there's a very strong notion that it isn't about wondering about what the future will be like. It's about actively choosing to build them. And for me, it's about building a future that is more fair and more just and more equitable than the present in which we find ourselves. It's about doing that in a way that ensures technology is always and already understood to be in a dialogue with human beings, and that the ecological and the environmental needs to be in that conversation too. And it's about how we do all of that. So here's the thing. That's a lot to digest. Key points are: technology has a history. That history is never as clear-cut as it seems. Knowing a little bit about that history makes you better able to ask questions about the present and to think about building a new future. And that's what we're doing here in Australia, and also at the Australian National University. So if any of that sounded in the slightest bit appealing, or you can think of someone else that ought to be in that conversation with us, will you send them my way? Because the other thing I learned in Silicon Valley, other than the fact that if you want a different future, you've got to build one, is that you should never do it by yourself, that you should always do it with other people and other voices and other conversations. And so if in listening to all of this, you think, oh, I know someone that should be talking to that mob, will you send them my way? Because I want to build a different future and I know we need help doing it. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you.